All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jovana Lazic, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And on behalf of our center and in collaboration with Stanford University Libraries and the Baltic Studies program there, I'd like to welcome you to the first public event of the quarter for us. We're very pleased today to have with us Donatas Kučinas, who is a Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, and also a Research Fellow at Wolfson College, Cambridge, and a Senior Research Fellow at the Lithuanian Institute of History. He has a DPhil in history from the University of Oxford and a couple of master's degrees, one in law, in public international law from Leiden University, and another in international relations and European studies from the Central European University, and his undergraduate work was in political science at Vilnius University. His research interests are broad and include modern international history, relations between East, Central, and Western Europe in the interwar period, cultural and intellectual history of diplomacy, geopolitics of the Baltic Sea region, the history of NATO enlargement, international law of global security, and also contemporary Russian foreign policy. He has a forthcoming book entitled The Vilnius Conflict in European Diplomacy, 1919 to 1923, with Oxford University Press, which he just shared with me will be out in November. So we are very pleased to have you join us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much for such a generous introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out today. And thank you particularly, Lisi, for inviting me here. It's my greatest pleasure to visit Stanford, which is actually the first time. So today, we'll be looking at how these two strongmen, essentially Józef Piłsudski of Poland in the interwar period, and Vladimir Putin of Russia, pretty much today, approached and treated what they considered to be their lesser brothers, in the form of Lithuania and Ukraine, respectively. So just a few disclaimers, little disclaimers in the beginning that I have to make before we start. So my motivation here is purely scholarly or academic. So it's not about proving how bad the Poles were to the Lithuanians, or that Piłsudski was as bad as Putin, or vice versa. I'm not there to perpetuate this, as they say, Lithuanian-Polish historical ding-dong that nationalist historians sometimes like to do, just for the heck of it. I don't know if you've heard this word ding-dong. Do you use ding-dong in American? Yeah? So this basically refers to sort of persistent and long-term animosity or conflict between two countries. I think it refers to like the sounds of fencing or something, ding dong, ding dong. So anyway, so these similarities actually, how Putin and Piłsudski saw and treated their lesser brother countries, is something that organically came out of my research, which you mentioned in the introduction. My research on the Vilnius question. It was basically just a very interesting observation, because I was writing this book at about the time when the Ukrainian-Russian ding-dong was starting to escalate. And to me, just watching the news and reading all these papers, this was just such a déjà vu, I've heard all of this before, in the form of Piłsudski and his pals. So the lecture of today will be about that. Finally, I'd like to point out that Putin and Piłsudski are just two names, two figures. What's more important here is the particular schools of thought that they represent. And sometimes these schools of thought are pretty much countrywide on certain issues. So now I'm just trying to determine how much of a context do you need before we start this. Putin and Piłsudski, Putin, I don't know, you probably know Piłsudski too. Is anyone who Is there anyone who doesn't know who Piłsudski is or what he's about? Okay, so Piłsudski was essentially the man in Poland. He died in 1935, so he was basically one of the founding fathers of the Polish Republic after the First World War. He was the chief of state, he was later dictator of Poland, and especially in relations with Lithuanians, he was the man there. He controlled everything. He was also a military leader, military general, although he didn't go to a military school. He led his Polish legions in fights against pretty much anyone around Poland. He also is credited for beating the Red Army next to Warsaw in 1920. So he's a very big figure in Poland with a very big cult of personality, just like Putin, by the way, is in Russia. So in that sense, these two guys are quite similar. Now, another thing is the whole Lithuanian-Polish ding-dong. Just for those who, again, don't know what it's about, most of it is territorial. Lithuania and Poland did not have diplomatic relations throughout the entire interwar period, and they were in this perpetual state of Cold War, which almost turned to hot war at some points. And the problem was that after the First World War, both of these countries, the new Poland and the new Lithuania, they claimed the city of Vilnius and its region as their own, basically. So Lithuanians claimed it on the basis that it was their ancient capital, and Vilnius, as you know, it's the current capital of Lithuania, while the Poles claimed it on all sorts of other reasons, including statistics, ethnicity statistics, and so on, claiming that there were more Poles than Lithuanians in Vilnius, and so on. And another thing, so what happened was basically that in 1920, the Poles snatched Vilnius from the Lithuanians in this sort of cunning stage of mutiny, and they kept Vilnius to themselves for the entire interwar period until Stalin gave it back to the Lithuanians in 1939 after, pretty much capturing both Poland and Lithuania. So, and another point in this whole Lithuanian-Polish ding-dong, there were more, but I'm just going to outline the main ones. Is that Lithuanian nationalism in itself was fundamentally anti-Polish. So it was not anti-Russian, it was not anti-German, it was anti-Polish. Because the main thing that the early Lithuanian nationalists feared was that essentially Lithuanian language becoming extinct. This was this a bit like Habsburg ethno-linguistic nationalism, whereby the Czechs, for instance, had the same with the German language and so on. So Lithuanians had the same issue with Polish culture, which they wanted to neutralize and to replace it with sort of new Lithuanian culture, promoting Lithuanian language and promoting that sort of folklore research and so on. So much about the Lithuanian-Polish ding-dong, just for the context. Now let's unpack the title of this talk. Nравится, не нравится, терпимая красавица, or which roughly translates like it or not like it, endure it, my beauty, or something like that. This is a phrase used by Putin in a summit with Emmanuel Macron in Moscow on the 7th of February 2022, so just a few weeks before the full-scale invasion. And the context for that was that the Russians blamed Ukraine and the West for ditching the Minsk agreements that Ukraine signed in 2014-2015, where Russians agreed to stop their offensive in Donbass in return for Ukrainian pledge to give Donbass political autonomy for Donbass, and at the same time give Russia a say on Ukraine's foreign policy course. This was the Russian way to block Ukraine's NATO membership and to counter its drift towards the West. After Russians lost hope in the Minsk agreements, they invaded Ukraine in full full-scale invasion in 2022. So the full quote sounds something like this. Putin says, as to the Minsk agreements, are they still alive and do they have a future or not? I think that there is no other alternative. In Kiev, one time they say that they are going to fulfill these agreements, another time they say that doing this would destroy their country. The Ukrainian president recently announced that he doesn't even like a single clause in those agreements. Well, like it or not like it, it's your duty, my duty. The agreements need to be fulfilled and there is no other way. End of quote. Now, I think a picture is worth more than 1,000 words. I was thinking long and hard of how to illustrate this like it or not like it situation, and I came up with this. So this is essentially a painting of Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky holding hands, and this is your dog in the background. Actually, this is not true, but only partially. So this is indeed a Renaissance painting of someone that looks very much like Vladimir Putin. And this is a sort of wedding situation, a Renaissance wedding situation. And this guy's holding his wife's hand. And this picture gives these sort of creepy vibes of like it or not like it, endure is my duty. Because, this guy is basically saying now that we're united under God, well, now we'll have to do as you say. Or else, and she's, you can see it in her, the way she looks, she's not totally docile. She's like, yeah, whatever, we'll see about that, you creep, So, and it's exactly the same, I think, in these two geopolitical cases that we will be discussing today in relations between big powers and something that they consider to be their lesser brother countries. And we will see that this relationship dynamic can indeed be very similar to the vibes you get from this very picture. Which leads us to the concept of lesser brotherhood in the heads of Putin, Piłsudski, and the forces or schools of thought that they represented. So I've distilled all this into essentially 5 principles of lesser brotherhood. And I will illustrate each of them with what Putin and Piłsudski thought or did about them. So let's go to the first principle, which says that we are predestined to be together forever, and you cannot do without us. This is what the big brother tells the lesser brother, basically. This is the principle whereby the big brother uses historical, economic, cultural, or religious factors to show that independent existence of the lesser brother country would be irrational, unfeasible, improbable, or outright impossible. Now let's start with Putin, what Putin had to say about this. So in his famous essay on Russians and Ukrainians, Putin spills much ink to show that Russian and Ukrainian polities are indeed inseparable due to common history and shared culture. By the way, interestingly enough, Ukrainians were called Little Russians in 19th century Russian Empire. And also Putin is sometimes using this word again, Little Russians, to refer to Ukrainians. And of course, the Russians are like the Great Russians there. So in case of Russia-Ukraine relations, this lesser brotherhood was very much in the vocabulary, itself. Literally, it was even in the maps of Russian Empire. So anyway, these Ukrainians or Little Russians, Putin says, they helped to build this big common country, whether it's the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, and helped to build their statehood, culture, and science together with the Russians. Then he argues that in the Soviet period, Ukrainians were promoted to the highest posts in the Soviet Union, including in its leadership. Here he mentions Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev, whose careers were very much about Ukraine. And then also in history, Putin remembers common struggle against bloody Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth in the early modern period. Then there is this joint inseparable culture argument. Putin mentions Ukrainian poets and writers like Taras Shevchenko, and who wrote in both Russian and Ukrainian languages. Same with Nikolai Gogol, one of the most famous Russian novelists, who was born in Ukraine. And so Putin says it's impossible to divide like these guys, to own them. We shouldn't even try it. Cultural divorce is not possible between Russia and Ukraine. Then you have indivisible locations like Kiev, the mother of all Russian cities, and Kievan Rus as the mother of modern Russia and Ukraine. And then he talks about this Commonwealth of Little Russians, Belarusians, and Great Russians, and of course the common Orthodox religion, and the sort of spiritual unity between Ukrainians and Russians. And this argument that you cannot do without us comes out really strongly in Putin's thinking about Ukraine. And he says, quote, true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Now, if we go to Piłsudski, it's exactly the same arguments that Piłsudski used in the Lithuanian case. Arguments of cultural, historical, and civilizational indivisibility of Lithuania and Poland. You can find it in the reasoning not only of Piłsudski, but also in all sorts of other Polish statesmen when they talk about Lithuania. Piłsudski essentially was a fan and a hire of Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth. He was this old school person that was faithful to this tradition of this common nobility. The history was that Lithuania and Poland had common rulers, common historical enemies in the form of mainly Russians, Germans, and the Swedes. Common historical struggle against Russian oppression, common uprisings against the Russian Empire in the 19th century, common poets like Adam Mickiewicz, who wrote in Polish but considered Lithuania to be his motherland. And Piłsudski himself often boasted that he was a Lithuanian. He was born in what is now Lithuania, north of Vilnius, and he went to school in Vilnius, although he couldn't speak Lithuanian. Again, just in case of Putin, this like it or not like it argument comes out really strongly in Piłsudski's reasoning. Lithuania, wrote Piłsudski back in 1898, quote, will be with us and will share our fate whether it wants it or not, end of quote. Which leads us to our second principle, which says nationalism, good when I do it, but bad when you do it. This is a principle that implies hypocrisy, where the big brother tries to discredit lesser brother's nationalism from some sort of cosmopolitan or commonwealth or even from a socialist perspective, but at the same time being nationalists to the bone themselves. So let's start with Putin. Putin portrays Ukrainian nationalism as some sort of fascist abomination. Emphasis is, of course, on radicals and neo-Nazis running everywhere in Kiev and elsewhere. Putin complains that their slogans, ideology, blatant aggressive Russophobia have to a large extent become defining elements of state policy in Ukraine. And all the things that united Russia and Ukraine, these crazies are trying to destroy. And of course, first and foremost, they're trying to destroy the Russian language that unites the Ukrainian and Russian nations. Putin, like many other Russians, sometimes like to call Ukrainian nationalists banderovцы after Ukrainian far-right leader Stepan Bandera. The good when I do it, bad when you do it hypocrisy comes out really clearly in Putin's essay. On the one hand, Putin asks, what's the difference? Why do we have to care how who people consider themselves to be? Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, it doesn't matter. We're all one big family. But just a few sentences later, he goes on to count ethnic Russians in Ukraine and complains that Russians in Ukraine are being forced to deny the ethnic Russian roots. And he says, as a result of such a harsh and artificial divisions of Russians and Ukrainians, the Russian people in all may decrease by hundreds of thousands or even millions in Ukraine. So first he says that ethnicity doesn't matter and it's sort of artificial, and then he immediately contradicts himself by raising concerns about decreasing numbers of ethnic Russians. Now, Piłsudski again is exactly the same. It's like a mirror thing of Putin here. Lithuanian nationalism in corpore was totally alien to him. For him, Lithuania was the natural extension of Poland, cemented by the dominance of the Polish culture. Again, there is this talk about we're all a family, doesn't matter who we are, what language you speak, Polish, Lithuanian. But again, he's counting Poles everywhere. It's just whenever there is a few Poles, they start counting them. He says that Lithuanians cannot have Vilnius because there is too many Poles there. So you have to decide if you're this or that. You cannot do both. But we can give Vilnius to you if you come under us in a federation. Of course, that was basically Piłsudski's idea, to use Vilnius as a bait to get Lithuanians into a common state. For Piłsudski, Lithuanian nationalism could only be tolerated if it was pro-Polish. That was the crux of it, basically. But since Lithuanian nationalism was anti-Polish in its very essence, there was nothing there that Piłsudski or guys like him could like. He did not like the Lithuanian campaign of Lithuanization, which sought to reduce the influence of Polish culture. Just as Putin with Ukraine, he did not like the whole profile of a Lithuanian nationalist, because just as Ukrainian nationalism, in case of Russian-Ukrainian ding-dong, Lithuanian nationalism was based on very different historical narratives than Polish nationalism. While Piłsudski partially identified himself with the historical Commonwealth, Lithuanian nationalists essentially ripped all that chapter from their history and called it some sort of dark ages where Poland exploited us, basically. And so Piłsudski and his contemporaries sometimes even called Lithuanian nationalists Litvomani, Lithuaniomaniacs. These crazy, similar like for Putin, were banderovci. And tried to do a regime change in Kaunas many times, trying to replace these Lithuaniomaniacs with pro-Polish government. These attempts failed, but he tried. And yet Piłsudski was an offensive Polish nationalist himself, who was in favor of spreading Polishness in eastern borderlands by military means if necessary. The third principle. If you do not like me, it's not because I suffer. It's because our enemies turned you against us. Again, this topic that is very common in Putin's reasoning. Putin saw Maidan in 2014 essentially as a CIA operation under the EU flag, basically. The idea that it was the bloody Americans who ruined the Russo-Ukrainian friendship. Victoria F. the EU Nuland, John McCain and pals, distributing buns to protesters. This is very deep in Russian psyche. Now, of course, there is evidence that the Americans indeed took a pro-war stance, especially in the spring of 2022, for instance, during Istanbul negotiations. So blaming the Americans is not that difficult for someone like Putin. But what is difficult is blaming the EU. Because the EU is not a bloody military power like the Americans. It's a civilian power. Europeans were mostly against the war, like the French especially, and the Germans. Ukraine-EU association agreement was about economics, about freedoms, and all that innocent civilian jazz. So here Putin is really at pains to pursue that evil EU argument. Like, how do you argue against that? Unless it's one of the weakest points in this whole argumentation. Simply for the fact that the EU is much better off economically, and not only economically compared to Russia, but according to all sorts of indicators of development. So they just could offer a deal that Russia couldn't match. So what do you do as Putin? So here Putin tries to improvise something, and here of course Putin is a Soviet guy, Soviet type, old school guy. So he tries to, we can see echoes of Soviet propaganda there. So he says the EU wants to take over Ukrainian economy and exploit its natural resources. The sale of agricultural land to foreigners is not that far off, it's coming for you guys. And it's obvious who will buy Ukrainian land. He acknowledges that indeed Ukraine might get some money from the EU, but Putin says that the conditions will be horrible, and the EU in any case will pursue its own imperialist interests, with preferences and benefits, of course, mostly for Western companies. And he asks, by the way, who will pay these debts back? Right? Apparently it is assumed that this will have to be done not only by today's generation of Ukrainians, but by their children and their grandchildren. So it's a bad deal. They want to exploit you. And then he goes on to say that Ukrainian oligarchs keep their stolen money in Western banks, ready to sell their motherland for the sake of preserving their capital, and Ukraine is hostage to EU capital and its geopolitical will. So again, Ukraine does not want to be with us because we suck as a model of development, but because these evil Americans and the bloody Europeans, they turned you guys against us for their sinister reasons. Now Piłsudski, again, exactly the same thing. In Piłsudski's book, a real Lithuanian could only wish to unite with Poland, and any sort of separatism of Lithuania must be a result of German, Russian, or British intrigues against us. He could not explain Lithuanian separatism otherwise. It just made no sense whatsoever to him, and he was almost paranoid about foreign influences in Lithuania. In their propaganda, Piłsudski's Poles painted Lithuanians as German agents, Bolshevik stooges, and even as British vassals. The idea was that once those influences are removed from Lithuania, Lithuania will sober up and will go back to loving Poland again. And Piłsudski's idea of removing these influences, in case of Russian influences, for instance, was to separate Lithuania from Russia by a land corridor, to isolate it from Russia, in other words, which Piłsudski did, by the way, in the late 1920s by carving this land corridor from Vilnius to Daugpilis in Latvia. But as we know, this did not bring Lithuanians back to his embrace. The fourth principle. If you leave me, I will wreck you. This is the phrase that probably divorce lawyers know very well. So if we go back to our painting of Putin and Zelensky. So this is basically Putin telling Zelensky, look, if you leave me, I'll take the bed, the dog, the chandelier, the mirror, and all the cool stuff. And also I'll report you to the church, and then you'll get burned on the stake or something like that. But if we, on a more serious note, this is basically the bigger brother country saying to its lesser brother country, if you go separate, we are going to strip you of all the territories that you've gained thanks to being united to us. And not only that, but we are also going to fight you and kill you if the need be. So let's start with the Russo-Ukrainian example here. Much of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict in modern times is about Crimea. Some say it's all about Crimea. Sevastopol has been the jewel of Russian geopolitics, home to their Black Sea Fleet, their main deep warm water port, and just overall a prime military real estate with extremely important strategic benefits for Russia. In the 50s, Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukrainian SSR, as you know, since it it was a common country back then, it was not seen as an issue. By the way, Ukrainian communists, they did not want to take Crimea. They said, no, we don't want it. Because the vegetables don't grow there, there is problems with water, we don't want it, it's just problems. But Khrushchev insisted and he forced Ukrainian communists to take Crimea in the 50s. But of course, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Crimea issue has never indeed been resolved. First, Russia pushed for a new Commonwealth with Ukraine already in 1991. Ukrainians, of course, said no. They said, we'll try this new independence thingy and see, where it gets us, but thank you for asking. And then the Russians pushed for wide autonomy for Crimea. Ukrainians again resisted. A compromise was reached in the late 90s, where Russia gave Ukraine 18% of the fleet, and Ukraine agreed to lease Crimean facilities to the Russian base there. It's important to stress that this whole Crimea ding-dong is not about Putin. It's a thing that resonates very much with Russians in general, and we can illustrate this with an example from Russian popular culture. In the 90s, there was a movie called Brat, and then its sequel, Brat 2, Brother 2. And as I tell my students in Cambridge, these two movies are everything you need to know about Russia if you can read between the lines, basically. It has everything there. It has the Russian-Ukrainian ding-dong, it has Russian-American ding-dong, it has the wide Russian soul there, it has this whole thing about this bloody transition period and so on. So all is there. So the scenario basically so these are the two brothers, and this is the villain, the American or Russian capitalist. So the scenario is that basically these two brothers, they have a friend who gets conned by an American capitalist in Russia. He loses money and eventually he gets killed. And these two brothers, they go on a mission to the United States to avenge their friend, to get the money back. And in the process, they go to the US, they kill a bunch of Ukrainian gangsters, they get their money back, they teach these capitalists a lesson, and then they triumphantly return back to Russia. So this is the plot of Brat 2 in a nutshell. Now there is a scene in this movie where the lesser brother kills a Ukrainian gangster and says, by the way, вы мне, гады, еще за Севастополь ответите. Which means, you dipshits, you will still pay us for Sevastopol. During the premiere screening of this movie in the late 90s in one of Russian cinemas with about 1,000 people there, this phrase was met with standing ovations. And remember that this is 1990s Russia, so it's not Putin, it's not ding dong yet. It's these nice 90s. So this resonates with them really, really strongly. And these Russian threats that Brat conveyed in 1990s, they materialized, of course, in 2014. There is a pro-American and pro-EU revolution in Ukraine. Moscow is sort of spooked big time by it. It fears that Ukraine is going to kick out the Russian base from Crimea, essentially, and install Americans there or something. So they take Crimea, they take parts of Donbass, and Putin claims that Donbass and Novorossiya were territories of Ukraine that were attached to it by Russia as a gift. And those gifts will have to go back to Russia if you decide to go with the Americans now. So you'll have to give it all back to them. So all good while we are married, but if you dare to leave us, we will bleed you dry and we will wreck you. Piłsudski, again, same with Piłsudski and Vilnius. So Vilnius is like Lithuania and Polish Crimea, okay, for these purposes. Perhaps even more important than that, because of its symbolic significance. So what Piłsudski does, he offers Lithuanians two options. Option A, you unite with us in some sort of federal union, then you get your precious Vilnius as your sort of cantonal capital, and we live happily thereafter. Option B, if you decide to do your independence thingy, which we do not recommend in any case, but if you do it, then we will strip you of the whole Vilnius region and everything that has even a scent of Polishness there. We will take you into a nutcracker by also trying to deny you the port of Memel in the west. And as a result, your little ramshackle rump state will not be able to make it, and sooner or later you are going to crawl back to us. Finally, fifth principle, but I still love you. This is the last principle of lesser brotherhood that both Piłsudski and Putin had in common. So sure, we took territories from you. Sure, we killed some of you guys, but we hope that one day you will come back to your senses and will ally with us again, and we'll forget this little misunderstanding. So the idea is that after all of this, it will still somehow will all be okay, and it's all recoverable, the relationship. On the day of annexing Vilnius, Piłsudski gave a speech where he said, quote, "But out of respect for the past, out of respect for the blood we shed together today, on the day of our great triumph, the Polish triumph, I cannot but extend my hand through the cordon that divides us to those Lithuanians there in Kaunas, who perhaps consider the day of our triumph a day of their defeat and mourning. I cannot but extend my hand, calling for reconciliation and love. I cannot but consider them brothers." End quote. Putin and the Russo-Ukrainian ding-dong, exactly the same. So after Putin takes Crimea and parts of Donbass, he then says, quote, "Our kinship with Ukraine has been transmitted from generation to generation, for we are one people." Today, these words may sound weird to you, may be perceived by some people with hostility, yet many people will hear me, and I will say one thing: Russia has never been and will never be anti-Ukraine, and what Ukraine will be, it's up to its citizens to decide. End of quote. Now, Piłsudski wasn't wrong, actually. Reconciliation between Lithuania and Poland really happened in the 90s, but it took hell on earth to make it happen. It took mostly Stalin to make it happen. Stalin captured both countries and gave Vilnius to the Lithuanians, basically. That was the story. And in the 90s, the new Poland did not claim it back. So there it ended, with some side effects, but they were not major. In case of Ukraine, however, it is really, really hard to see how this reconciliation can happen while this idea of lesser brotherhood continues to inform Russian-Ukraine policy.